Well, that's grand. Our magic table was filled again, and we were fed. It's kind of like that cruise of oil in the container of meal that was replenished by the widow who fed Elijah. Magically, we are fed, and let's be thankful to all those that have prepared it. It was a wonderful treat. Lots of energy goes into it. Continuing on the theme that our brother Nathan left off on, filling ourselves up, devouring the Word, taking it into ourselves. We're going to go back to the verse that we started with in Philippians chapter 2, where we're told to have the mind of Christ in verse 5. And it says that his vessel, it says in verse 7, that he emptied himself, he poured himself out. And if you think that little example that I gave you this morning about pouring out the pitcher was mine, it wasn't. Actually, Moses instituted it in the drink offering that was poured out. And Paul picks up on this theme in Philippians chapter 2, where he says in verse 17, "But even if I am being poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I rejoice and share my joy with you all." And he asks us further on in verse 20 to be a kindred spirit to him. And so with that frame of mind, we're going to start our second class. Whenever you're ready. This is the Winfield Bible School 2019. Our speaker is Brother Richard Morgan. And this is the second in his series on the plagues of Egypt. And the title for this second talk is Out of the Chaos, and there is no reading for it.
Thanks, Brother Claude, and good morning, everybody. So let me first explain the meaning behind this title, Order Out of Chaos. Order was a really, really important concept in Egypt. It was in the psyche of the Egyptians, the importance of order. And they even had a special word for it. I'm not sure whether you can read this up here. This is a rendition of one of the creation myths of the Egyptians. And what God is going to do in the plagues is he's going to return Egypt psychologically, as far as the Egyptians are concerned, to a state of chaos. In the beginning, the Egyptians said, very similar actually to the creation as recorded in Genesis 1, the Egyptians believed that the world was just a watery, dark chaos. And out of that watery, dark chaos, out of that abyss, God created, or the gods in the minds of the Egyptians made order. And they had a special word for it, and we're going to talk about this, what all of this means in our class this evening. So there's a little plug for our light evening this evening. They had a special word for it called Mart. We're going to talk about this, God willing, as well this evening. It's the Egyptian word for order. And for the Egyptians, order was extremely important, because you think about it, without the order of the seasons and so forth in Egypt, what would happen to it? I mean, this was a desert land. This was a land that relied on a certain order of events to keep Egypt alive. The snows would fall in the mountains to the south at a certain time of year, and then those snows would melt and they would feed into the Nile River, and that would cause the Nile to burst its banks in the area of Lower Egypt, where our story is, and that would cause fertile soil to be there in Egypt, and that would be the economy of Egypt, the feeding of the people, and so forth. Now, without that order of events, without the snow falling and melting, and then what is called the inundation of the Nile, Egypt would be ruined. So that order was extraordinarily important to the Egyptians. And what God is going to do in the plagues, brothers and sisters, is he is going to bring Egypt to its knees. He is going to bring chaos into the world of the Egyptians. But out of that chaos, which will eventuate, of course, in the Red Sea, where the Egyptian armies are going to be, they're going to return to the abyss, the watery abyss, the darkness of the waters of the Red Sea. He's going to utterly annihilate, destroy Egypt. But out of the chaos that he brings Egypt to is going to emerge a new person, the children of Israel, God's adopted son, and he is going to bring now order to their lives. And the whole thing, brothers and sisters, is a parable for our lives. And it goes along with what Brother Nathan has been talking about. This is the parable of putting off the old man, destroying Egypt, that old man of the flesh, that carnal mind, and then replacing it with a new order of things. Not the order of Egypt, but now the order of the things of God. The spiritual mind of the new man in the Lord Jesus Christ. So let's think about then why God would pour out 10 plagues upon Egypt. Why did he do that? If God's purpose was simply to save Israel, and one of the things that's going to be demonstrated in the plagues is the sovereignty of God over all things, that he is the creator of everything, that he made heavens and earth and all that is therein, that he is omnipotent, all-powerful. He can do anything. And if his purpose was simply to save Israel, he could have taken his thumb and gone and squished Egypt and rescued Israel. Why go through the rigmarole of 10 plagues? If God's purpose is simply to save Israel. But we know that's not God's purpose. It's part of the process, but God's purpose is bigger than simply saving his people. So if we want to open your Bibles at Exodus chapter 7, we'll see here the purpose behind the plagues. This is when, for the second time, Moses and Aaron go into the court of Pharaoh. They start in going into his court in chapter 5. But in chapter 7, they return to the court of Pharaoh. And in his introduction to the plagues, you remember the scene that they're there, and there's the challenge that is opened up to Pharaoh. And Aaron throws down his rod and it becomes a serpent. And the magicians of Egypt do the same. And then Aaron's rod swallows up their rods. We'll talk about that this evening. And then in verse 5 we get the explanation of why these plagues occurred. And it's for the education of the Egyptians. So verse 5 of chapter 7 says, "The Egyptians shall know." This is about getting knowledge into the minds of the Egyptians. "They shall know that I am Yahweh, when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them." So that is then the purpose of why God is going to stretch out his hand over Egypt. He's going to display his power in these 10 plagues, that they might know that I am Yahweh. Because they didn't know who Yahweh was. They might have heard of him. They might have had this vague notion that there was a God of the Hebrews and his name was Yahweh, but he got lost among this whole mass of gods that the Egyptians worshipped. And brothers and sisters, they had hundreds of gods. You can get books on the gods of Egypt, and they're thick books. They had gods for everything. Anything in life was explained as a god. An ant crawls across the floor, there's a god. Or a beetle, or the sun shining, or the inundation of the Nile, or hail falling from heaven, or whatever it was. The way that the Egyptians and many ancient cultures, of course, explained these things without the knowledge of the one true God who created all things, they said, well, each of these phenomena is a god in and of itself. So this Yahweh God of the Hebrews, yeah, well, he probably is in charge of Canaan in some way, but we Egyptians, we don't really know who he is. Well, God is going to change that. He's going to disrupt their lives. He's going to turn their world upside down. And he is going to demonstrate that he is sovereign over all things. That there is no God of the frog. There is no God of the hail. I am Yahweh, and I created all of these things, and they are under my control. I am sovereign. That's going to be the grand education experience then for the Egyptians. And you can look at various verses like these three I have on the screen here. Sorry if that's a little bit small. This is designed for a widescreen panoramic experience. But in Exodus chapter 12, in the story of plague number 10, the death of the firstborn, look at this comment. It says, "And all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment." You may have heard this concept before, that the plagues were directed against the gods of Egypt. But I'll add to that, brothers and sisters, this is not just about the gods of Egypt. This is getting into the very psyche of the Egyptians. This is God who is going to absolutely, completely and utterly dismantle and demolish everything Egyptian. Their culture, their religion, their way of thinking, how they view the world. Their whole worldview is going to be shattered by the 10 plagues. And Jethro saw that. In Exodus chapter 18, this is Jethro remarking that having witnessed the plagues, that this Yahweh is greater than all the gods. So Jethro learned the lesson. And he came to appreciate how great this Yahweh is. Words that are echoed in a number of the Psalms. A number of the Psalms actually focus in on the Exodus and explain that Yahweh is greater than all the gods of Egypt. And then there's another verse here in Numbers chapter 33. On their gods, Yahweh executed judgment. So that is what God is going to do for the Egyptians. They don't know Yahweh yet. All they know is all their gods, like Ra, the sun god, and Osiris, and then according to the Egyptians, the Nile was the bloodstream of the god Osiris, and Pharaoh himself was a physical manifestation of the god Horus, and they had gods for this, that, and the other. And they're going to learn that there is really only one supreme and true God who is in charge of absolutely everything. So you may have seen, if you have really good eyesight, this sort of chart before. You can Google this sort of thing on the internet, put in something like plagues of Egypt, gods of Egypt, and you'll get this sort of chart where various commentators have tried to match each of the 10 plagues with one or more of the gods of Egypt. So the Egyptians did have gods of the Nile, not strictly gods of the Nile itself. The Nile wasn't seen to be a god, it was seen to be the bloodstream of a god. They had gods, though, of the inundation of the Nile, a god that caused the flooding of the Nile. They had a frog god, that's my personal favorite, that's Heket, the frog goddess. She was the goddess of the midwives of Egypt, and so on. You can go down the list and you can match each of the plagues with one or more of the gods of Egypt. So again, Yahweh is demonstrating, I am in control of these things. That's the fundamental lesson for the Egyptians. Now, turn on to chapter 10 of Exodus. And in between plague number 7, which is, what's plague number 7? Without looking at that. By the end of the week, you are going to know the order of the plagues. What's plague number 7? Hail. Hail. And what's plague number 8? Locusts. Right. You will know this off by heart by the end of the week. Now, in between plague number 7 and plague number 8, look at this comment here. Just learned in chapter 7 that this was an education for the Egyptians, that they might know that I am Yahweh. And that's a constant refrain that's repeated through the story of the plagues. But look what it says here now in chapter 10. So, plague number 7 really ends the education for the Egyptians. By the end of plague number 7, God is done with the Egyptians. And now he turns his attention more to education of another group of people. This is rather intriguing. So, verse 1 says that God said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh, that I may show these signs of mine among them." And verse 2 says that you that you may tell in the hearing of your son, of your grandson, how I have dealt harshly with the Egyptians and what signs I have done among them, that you may know that I am Yahweh. So it was the exact same education experience for the children of Israel. And the inference from that, brothers and sisters, is that the Israelites were just as ignorant as the Egyptians. And I don't know whether you've thought about this before. Did the Hebrews at the time of Moses know who Yahweh was? There's a couple of hints that no, they didn't. In fact, what the Israelites had done is they had completely bought into Egyptian culture and religion. Yes, they're a separate people in the land of Goshen, but what separates them from the Egyptians are simply physical things, like they originated from Canaan and they're slaves. But to all intents and purposes, they were Egyptian in their thinking. And there's evidence of that all the way through the wilderness wanderings. They really struggled to let Egypt go. God brought them physically out of Egypt. But it took 40 years at least to get Egypt out of them. It's as if, brothers and sisters, they were possessed with Egypt. And I use that word purposefully. They were possessed with the thinking of Egypt. And that's the language that we have in the New Testament, where Jesus casts out demons. As our brother Nathan explained in his first class, these are all parables of putting to death the old man of the flesh. And even more than that, they're parables of casting out the thinking of things like Egypt. And even in New Testament times, we'll talk about this later this week, the Jews were still possessed with the thinking of Egypt. The gods of Egypt had got into them, into their psyche. So there's a couple of verses that we could look at that demonstrate this a little bit more. In Leviticus chapter 17, talking about the generation who have come out of Egypt, it says, they shall no more sacrifice their sacrifices to goat demons. Telling us that they had been sacrificing to goat demons, not to Yahweh. They weren't involved in worship of Yahweh in Egypt. They were sacrificing to goat demons. And now what God is going to do is going to bring order to their lives and teach them what true sacrifice is. He's going to demolish Egypt in their lives and bring about truth. And even more expressly, this is much clearer in Joshua. It says, now therefore fear Yahweh, the one and true and living God. Serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. Put away the gods that your father served beyond the river and in Egypt. So that's who the children of Israel were worshipping in Egypt. They weren't worshipping Yahweh. They didn't know who he was. They needed the 10 plagues and what happened subsequently to teach them who this Yahweh is. And so they were just as ignorant, and they needed the same education as the Egyptians. And brothers and sisters, the lesson for us is the same. We're no different from people in the world. We too need to be taught what is truth. Now, for the majority of this class, we're going to do a little survey through each of the 10 plagues. And what I want to demonstrate to you, brothers and sisters, is that in this education experience for Egypt and Israel, that God is going to start off slow and then gradually build things up. There is a progression through these 10 plagues. And on the screen there you can see, and many commentators do this, they split the first 9 plagues into 3 groups of 3. And then plague number 10 is its special own plague on its own, the death of the firstborn. So in the first 3 plagues, these are rather annoying, but they're not going to kill you. So, I don't know whether anybody's ever had a plague of frogs in their house. We had a plague of flies once in our house. That's always a lot of fun. But it's annoying, but it's not going to kill you. Likewise with gnats. There was a plague of gnats out on the walkway yesterday, and I was just like wafting them out of the way. I was like, oh, this is I'm experiencing life in Egypt right now. So it's annoying, but it's not going to do anything harmful to you. But then God ups the ante in plagues 4, 5, and 6, and he brings disease into Egypt. He afflicts Egypt with something they were really, really afraid of. And we're going to talk about this more, God willing, in our class tomorrow, disease. And then plague 7, 8, and 9, before we get to the grand finale in plague number 10, God now is going to annihilate Egypt. Completely destroy everything that Egypt stood for. And as we go through this, brothers and sisters, just think, is there a way in which God does the same in our lives? In deconstructing our lives, which by nature are Egyptian. And maybe God works in our lives in this way too, through things which are annoying, but sometimes we need affliction, and sometimes God just needs to annihilate our lives and then recreate in us a new person. So think about that as we go through this. So in plague number 1, let's just notice how God gradually increases the display of his power and the lesson for Egypt and Israel. So plague number 1, the water turning into blood. Now look at chapter 7, about verses 22, 23, 24. And notice there how this was frustrating for the Egyptians. It was annoying. I mean, you turn on your tap and out comes blood. That's pretty disgusting. But there are other water sources. And what we find in those verses, the end of chapter 7, is that, number 1, the magicians were able to copy this plague. So that's not so great, Moses and Aaron. Our magicians can do the same thing. Not only that, but the Egyptians found a solution. Do you see that in, I think it's verse 24? They dug parallel to the Nile, and they could dig down, and they found, oh, we can get fresh water this way. So it didn't do anything particularly bad to the Egyptians, but at the same time, this was a symbol of things which were to get much, much worse. Now, at the beginning of chapter 8, we get the plague of frogs. And similarly, this is annoying. Frogs are pretty disgusting creatures as far as I'm concerned. They're slimy and green and yucky. These were not poison dart frogs, which are one of the most poisonous animals, I think, in the world. These were just normal, ugly frogs, green, slimy. And you try to get into bed and there's frogs. You're trying to cook dinner and there's frogs. There's just frogs absolutely everywhere. So it's disgusting, but it's not going to kill you. Once again, and this is in verses 6 to 8, we find the magicians could copy this. We don't know exactly how they could do this, but they managed to do something similar. But the difference now with this plague is that they cannot come up with a solution to the problem, unlike in plague number 1. Pharaoh has to go to Moses and Aaron and say, guys, frogs, can you do something about this? Plead with Yahweh to take away the frog. So there's a little bit of an admission on the part of the Egyptians that they're not quite as powerful as whatever Moses and Aaron represent. So a little bit extra in the display of power in plague number 2. Now we looked at this in our exhortation yesterday in plague number 3, the plague of gnats. Aaron takes his rod in verse 16, strikes the dust of the earth, and out come these gnats, or you might have lice in your version. The Hebrew word for lice or gnats simply means a small flying thing. It's not very descriptive. Some people think it was mosquitoes maybe that were bred from the stagnant water. May have been the case. So whatever it was, lice or gnats, again, this is something which is annoying, but it's not going to kill you. Now what we find there is that the magicians try to do the same thing, but this time the magicians are defeated. Now here we get an even greater display of the power of God, and the magicians say, this is the finger of God. Which is not quite an admission that this is the finger of Yahweh, In fact, the Egyptians had a concept of the finger of God. So they probably think it's one of their gods at this point. But the education is now going to continue in plagues 4, 5, and 6, where now God is going to bring disease. He's going to afflict the Egyptians. Now in plague number 4, which is the plague of, and you'll notice on the screen there I put plague of swarms. In your versions you'll have swarms of flies, probably. Of flies is not in the original. It just says swarms in the Hebrew Bible. A common Jewish interpretation is in fact that this was swarms of wild beasts, lions and tigers and bears, oh my. That was what the Jews think was happening here. Well, whether it was actually the teens came up with their idea, they think this was swarms of Canada geese. That was the general consensus, and so we're going to go with that this week. This was swarms of Canada geese. More likely than not, it was swarms of flies, but we can debate that issue. Whatever it was, there's a greater demonstration of God's power here in a number of ways. If you look at verse 22, now here's something a little bit different. It says in verse 22 that God now separates out the land of Goshen. Now that's pretty impressive. As far as I know, when you get a swarm of flies, there are no signs in the sky saying, flies, please do not enter here. They have the freedom of the skies to go wherever they want. So for God to separate out the land of Goshen, that's pretty impressive. And here Yahweh demonstrates that He is not only the creator of the fly, or the Canada goose, or whatever this was. He is not only the creator and the controller of the frog, and of the river Nile, and of gnats or lice or whatever that was, but He is sovereign over space. So he's increasing the demonstration of who this God is. And also He is sovereign over time. Look at verse 23. Tomorrow this is going to happen. Up until now, it could have been, well, you know, sometimes the Nile does get a little bit bloody because of, and it can turn to at least a red color because there is clay in the tributaries of the Nile that can get into the water supply of the Nile and turn it red. So this could have been just a natural phenomenon, and then that could have caused the fish in the river to die, and then the frogs come out, and that's going to breed flies. So up until now, they could have said, yeah, Moses and Aaron, you're just lucky that these things are occurring. Your timing is just right. But when you say this is going to occur tomorrow, there's no flies right now, but tomorrow there will be flies, and tomorrow it happens, then there is a demonstration that this God is sovereign not only over space, but He is sovereign over time. You'll also notice in verse 24 that there is no staff of Aaron or Moses this time. Beforehand, it was Moses and Aaron doing an action. Like Aaron stretching his rod out over the Nile or striking the dust of the ground. Now, it says in verse 24, simply, Yahweh did so, and there came great swarms of flies. This is now the direct hand of God on display. This is God's power. This is not trickery of Moses and Aaron. Just like the magicians use their trickery, their illusions to reproduce the first two plagues. Now, plague number 5, the plague of pestilence, gets even worse for the Egyptians. And this time it starts to affect their economy. Their livestock are afflicted with pestilence. We read about that in chapter 9. It says in verse 2 and 3 that this again is the hand of Yahweh. Look at verse 3. The hand of Yahweh. This is not from Moses or Aaron. This comes directly from this invisible creator deity. and it would fall a very severe plague upon your livestock, and it killed all of their animals, or at least a great proportion of their animals. So this is a little bit worse. This is not a bunch of frogs getting in the way. This is now livestock dying. And then we get to plague number 6, the pestilence. The plague of boils. And now it's not just affecting animals. Now it gets personal. You know, plague number 5, Bessie, your favorite cow, has died, and you're very sad, but it's just Bessie the cow. Now, though, it's you and your family. You're affected with a disease, boils breaking out over your body and killing your family members. And we notice there that the magicians make a reappearance in verse 11. It says the magicians, who we've forgotten about for a little while in plagues 4 and 5, they come back, but it says they could not stand before Moses because of the boils. The magicians of Egypt, who we'll see in our class tomorrow, are extremely important in Egyptian religion and culture, are defeated by the time we get halfway through the plagues. So that's plagues 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now we come to plagues 7, 8, and 9. And now God is going to finish off Egypt. He is going to annihilate everything that Egypt stands for. And you look at plague number 7, which is a plague of all plagues. This is the plague which is, and we're going to look at this, God willing, in our class on the hardening of Pharaoh's heart in more detail. This is the plague that finally gets through to Pharaoh, but it's also the plague which finally shows Pharaoh's true colors as he hardens his heart. And look at the destruction now in verse 18 and 19. Chapter 9, verse 18. Behold, about this time tomorrow, so again, God is sovereign over time, I'll cause very heavy hail to fall, such as has never been in Egypt from this day until it was founded until now. Now therefore send, get your livestock and all that you have in the field into safe shelter, for every man and beast that is in the field and is not brought home will die when the hail falls on them. First time I set foot in Canada in July 1994, there was a hailstorm. Like, this is fun. You know, I land in Canada in the middle of summer, there's a hailstorm. But it didn't kill me. This hail is different. This is hail, and it's an unusual hail. The hail was kind of this translucent ice, and there was fire inside the hail. And this is not like normal hail. And if it hits you, it's going to kill you. So God now is going to decimate and kill every living thing that's outside by this hail. And what he's going to demonstrate here is emphasized in verse 29, which says, at the end of the verse, that God is going to cause this to cease, so that, the end of verse 29, you may know that the earth, not just the elements of creation, but the earth itself is Yahweh's, belongs to Him. It's His. And He is in charge and sovereign over all things. Now God is going to complete His education for the Egyptians in particular. And then we come to plague number 8, which is the plague of locusts. Now, I don't know about you, but a plague of locusts sounds absolutely terrifying to me. I don't know, have you read up on plagues of locusts that they have in some countries today? Billions upon billions and miles thick of big bugs. I mean, I run away if there's one bug. If there's billions of bugs, I don't know what I'd do. It's absolutely terrifying. And we're told in chapter 10 and verse 14, this was the biggest plague of locusts ever, and we're told that they ate every green thing. God here is absolutely decimating the economy of Egypt. Just think about what he's doing here. Again, we come back to the order of the Egyptians. This was everything to the Egyptians, the production of crops, and the reliance upon the snows and the melting of the snow and the inundation of the Nile, the production of fertile soil, and then the growth of these crops. And everything's worked up until now, and now here is this God who brings a whole plague of locusts and destroys it all. He's destroying the very economy of Egypt and turning their world upside down, bringing them completely to their knees. Till we get to plague number 9. Who knows how long it was dark for in plague number 9? Without looking at your Bibles. How long was it dark for? I can't hear. 3 days. Can you imagine 3 days? And this was not just, like you might, anyone ever been to the Arctic Circle around that area? In the winter, it's dark for 6 months. But it's not a darkness in which you can't see a hand in front of your face. You can still see, it's just dark. Okay? It's like living in the city. When it gets dark at night, you can still go out even if there's no light. You still see, it's dim, but you can still see. This was a darkness. You can read about this in verse 21 and 22 of chapter 10. This was a darkness, we're told, that could be felt. It's a poetic language to describe. This is just intense darkness. We experienced this sort of darkness once in Kentucky, in what are called the Mammoth Caves. Has anyone ever been there? Amazing group of caves, 450 miles of cave systems. We went on a cave tour, and of course you bring your flashlights with you, but you go to this one cave and they say, everyone turn off your lights. And I've never experienced darkness like this. Absolute, complete and utter darkness. And you can't figure out where you are or where anything is. If you close your eyes, you can still kind of like sense that there is light and stuff. You couldn't sense that. It was absolute thick darkness. So this is a darkness that could be felt. Now for the Egyptians, why was this so? Why leave this to plague number 9? You think, well, why is this worse than locusts? And were they just afraid of the dark? Well, actually, yes, they were. They were very afraid of the dark. And this goes back to the Egyptian concept of order. For them, darkness was something that played right into their whole mythology regarding their main god, which was the sun god, called Ra or Re or Amun-Ra. They had various names for this god. What the Egyptians believed is that this sun god, who was the father of all the other gods, at night he was actually chased across the heavens by an evil god. I forget his name at the moment, but he was chased across the heavens, and in the morning he reappears, and all the Egyptians are like, phew, he survived. Now, can you imagine what's going through the Egyptian mind when their main god disappears for 3 days? And it's a symbol for the Egyptians that what Yahweh is doing here is he is destroying their world. He's absolutely turning their world upside down and bringing Egypt to their knees. And then plague number 10, the death of the firstborn, and finally Egypt is completely broken by the hand of God, and the final nail in the coffin at the Red Sea is when the Egyptian armies return to that watery abyss. Egypt returns to chaos. For the Egyptians was absolutely frightening beyond belief. We're going to talk about this, God willing, as I said in our class, in our light evening this evening, when we're going to look at the Egyptian concept of order and chaos, and the fears the Egyptians had of their order being disrupted. And it's disrupted big time now by the hand of this God of the Hebrews. So what we're seeing here, brothers and sisters, is God ruining Egypt. If you look in chapter 10 and verse 7, some of Pharaoh's servants actually recognize this. It says in chapter 10 verse 7, then Pharaoh's servants said to him, How long shall this man be a snare to us? Let the men go, that they may serve Yahweh their God. Do you not yet understand that Egypt is ruined or destroyed? It's exactly what God did. He destroyed Egypt. And sometimes when you get to plague number 7 and the hail, and then plague 8, the locusts, you kind of feel sorry a little bit for the Egyptians. But you've forgotten plagues 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, where God isn't demonstrating his power straight away. He leads them in slowly. And actually in plague number 7, the plague of hail, God says to the Egyptians, you've seen all these plagues up until now. I'm going to bring another plague. Go inside, get out. He gave them opportunity to be saved. And if they had ears to hear, and this is one of the main lessons of the plagues, brothers and sisters, that we're going to emphasize all the way through, is are we listening to the voice of God? This is what God is trying to do here with these plagues. He's trying to catch their attention so they listen to his voice. And for some of the Egyptians, they did listen. They did heed the warning. So don't feel sorry for the Egyptians. They had every opportunity. And yet many of them, like Pharaoh, hardened their hearts. So God is ruining, he's destroying Egypt. And what he's in effect doing, brothers and sisters, in returning them to this watery abyss, is he's reversing the creation of Egypt. Returning them to like a pre-creation state. And it's this connection with creation which is really rather intriguing. So let's have a look at this. So here's that same division of the first 9 plagues into 3 groups of 3. And what we can do is we can match that with creation. Because this is one of the things, of course, that's being demonstrated in the plagues, is that this Yahweh is the creator of all of these things. And we know in the Genesis creation, God divided creation into 3 realms. Day 1, he created realm number 1, the heavens. Day 2, realm number 2, the waters. Day 3, realm number 3, the land. And then day 4, he filled the heavens. Day 5, he filled the waters. Day 6, he filled the land. Now we can kind of see this in the 3 areas of the plagues which match these 3 realms. So plagues 1, 2, and 3 are focused more on the water. We get the Nile turning to blood, we get the frogs, amphibious creatures jumping out of the water, and then this stagnant water now is going to produce these flying insects. Some people think that they were actually mosquitoes. And then we get more focused on land. We get the swarms, whatever they were, maybe wild beasts, but maybe flies, we don't know. And then the livestock is affected and man is affected, so land-dwelling animals. And then plague 7, 8, and 9 focus then on the heavens. We get the hail coming from heaven. We get the locusts filling the sky. We get the sun being blanked out. So there's definitely, whether you split it up like that or in some other way, definitely there is, our minds are brought to creation. God is demonstrating, I am the creator of all of these things. What the Egyptians, and this is true really of all pagan religions, is that they didn't really have the same concept of created things as is demonstrated in the Bible. Even if they believed in creator gods, it wasn't the same sort of thing. In fact, all of their gods were really contained within the thing that they were the god of. So for instance, the god of the frog only had an existence inside of that frog. Outside of the context of the frog, that God had no meaning at all. Only within the frog it had any meaning. But with Yahweh, he's different. He's not contained within creation. He is sovereign over creation. And that's fundamentally different from the pagan concept. This is what is being demonstrated here. So let's think then about this connection with creation. God is reversing the creation of Egypt. So what other connections can we see with creation? Well, how about, why there 10 plagues? Why 10? Sometimes numbers in Scripture have significance. I think we can overdo it sometimes, but I think, the fact that there's 10, that sounds pretty significant. What other 10s do we have in the Bible? Well, that's my easiest question of the day. 10 Commandments. And we're going to talk about that later this week. And that's part of God bringing order out of chaos, in which out of this watery abyss of the destruction of Egypt, God now orders his people. He's used 10 plagues to bring about destruction, and now he uses 10 commandments to bring order and direction to this new people. So there's 10 commandments. But also, when we talk about creation, did you know, how did God create the heavens and earth? What did God use? Did he have a magic wand? Did he have the staff of Aaron or Moses? What did he do? His word, right. So this is the lesson of the plagues. Listen to the voice of God. That is what has ultimate power. This is a lesson that actually the children of Israel never really learned. They focused on the tangible, observable demonstration of power, but didn't appreciate the true power behind these things, which is the voice of God. So when it comes to creation, everyone read that? That says, and God said. So all of these are the utterances of God. We know this is a continual refrain in Genesis chapter 1. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God said, let there be, and there was. And there are 10 of those utterances in Genesis chapter 1. So I think it's significant then that we have the 10 utterances of God and this demonstration of creative power of Yahweh, that he created all things. And then we get 10 plagues, which are now going to reverse that creative process as far as Egypt is concerned. And then God again is going to utter 10 things to bring about now order to a new people. So 10 then is pretty significant. We're going to talk about this in our class this evening. This was on the first slide. This is a picture of the Egyptian idea of creation, this watery abyss. And out of this watery abyss, this dark, deep water, came all creation. So it's significant then that the first plague is the water being turned to blood. So our minds there are on the water, which stood for the life blood of Egypt, and that returns to chaos. It goes to blood. And then plague number 9, this is like bookends of this first group of plagues. Plague number 9, Egypt returns to darkness. It returns to chaos. Which would have been, brothers and sisters, a huge psychological blow to every Egypt who had bought into the Egyptian worldview. However, then out of that watery chaos came the creation of Israel. So let's think about this. If you want to turn to Exodus chapter 15, this is the chapter that follows on from the plagues and the destruction of Egypt in the Red Sea. So plague number 1, the water turning to blood, was like a foreshadowing of the final destruction of Egypt, where the Red Sea turns to blood because of the death of Egypt in the Red Sea. So Egypt utterly returned to this abyss in the Red Sea, returns to a pre-creation state. Out of that pre-creation state, out of the formlessness and the emptiness of the world in the Red Sea, now emerges onto dry ground a new person, his adopted son Israel. Now what happens in Exodus chapter 15? First of all, we get the Song of Moses, Miriam and the other women with their tambourines, and they sing this wonderful song of victory. But it's what happens immediately after which is rather intriguing. A little bit strange what occurs. But I'd like to introduce what happens here by just have a look at the progression here of the 10 plagues. Just think of the natural progression of these plagues. So if water turns to blood, and you live in the Nile, and you're a frog, what are you going to do? You're going to jump out, eh? So there is a natural progression from plague number 1 to plague number 2. You're a frog, you're going to jump out of the Nile. And they all jumped out. And they found new homes in Egypt. What happened to the frogs? They all died. You get this great big stinking mound of rotting frog flesh. This is what we're going to talk about tomorrow. My class tomorrow absolutely stinks. Just a pre-warning. It's the smelliest class I've ever given. You might want to bring a gas mask. It's really, really stinky. And Egypt stunk when the frogs all died. Now, you get a mound of rotting flesh, and you get stagnant water. What is going to breed? Okay? Flying insects. Mosquitoes, lice, gnats, flies. And what do flies carry? Disease. So you can see what God is doing in the first 6 plagues is he is infecting Egypt with disease. Now, this is another thing that the Egyptians were extremely afraid of. They were afraid of darkness, they were afraid of chaos, and they were afraid of disease. We're going to look at this tomorrow in more detail. They were absolutely obsessed with cleanliness, purification, and so forth. So for God to bring disease into their lives was psychologically for the Egyptians terrifying. Now, with that in mind, come with me to Exodus chapter 15 here. This new creation has come out of the watery abyss of the destruction of Egypt. And look at the first thing that happens here. Verse 22. Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. But when they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore it was named Marah, and the people grumbled. So it's interesting, isn't it? The first thing they come to is a problem regarding water. And this is really something that matches Egypt. They had a problem with their water, turned to blood. Israel encounters a similar thing. The water is bitter, they cannot drink it. Just like the Egyptians couldn't drink the waters of the Nile. But what God is going to do now in the following pages is he is going to reverse the 10 plagues. He's going to bring order out of the chaos. So what does God do to these bitter waters? Verse 25, they cried to Yahweh, and Yahweh showed him a log, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. God solves the problem. He brings order out of chaos. And then something rather strange happens. What is the very first thing that God promised to the children of Israel after they came out of the Red Sea? What's the first promise? I'll lead you into the land. I'll keep you safe. What's the very first thing he said? Well, let's have a read of it in the end of verse 25. It says that he made them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them, saying, if you will diligently, here's the lesson, listen to the voice of Yahweh your God. That, brothers and sisters, is where there is power. That is the creative force of God. When God speaks, amazing things happen. So if you want amazing things to happen in your life, listen to the voice of God. And if you do that, it's all he asks of us. Listen to that voice. Do what is right in his eyes. Give ear to his commandments. What will I do for you? Strangely, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians. Well, that's a little bit of a sort of what's the word I'm looking for? It's not what you were expecting, maybe. I won't give you any disease. You might expect something a little bit more. But what is going on here, brothers and sisters, is that God is reversing what happened in Egypt. Where he turned the waters to blood, he made them undrinkable, and then he brings disease into Egypt. But if you listen to my voice, I will make your waters sweet, and I will bring none of these diseases into your life. And then what follows on from there is God reversing plague 7, 8, 9, 10. What's the next thing that happens in chapter 16? Does he bring hail from heaven? How does he reverse that? That hail from heaven that destroyed the economy of Egypt. What comes from heaven in chapter 16? Manna, bread from heaven. This is a reversal of what happens. And then you get the locusts who eat up every green thing. They eat up all the sustenance of Egypt. What does God do? Chapter 16, he provides them with bread. Chapter 17, he provides them with water from the rock. He's reversing the chaos of Egypt. And then, instead of darkness, what does God do when he leads them through the wilderness? And the first place he brings them to is Sinai. What does he do at Sinai? He brings light into their lives. He enlightens them with a new order of things. Not now the order of the Egyptians, but the order of God's truth. And in reversing the death of the firstborn, now God has adopted Israel as his firstborn son. And the whole thing, brothers and sisters, is a grand, enormous object lesson for us to put off the old man and to put on the new. Sometimes we might be a little bit blasé about that. Yeah, we put off the old man and we put on the new. Well, this was demonstrated, brothers and sisters, by God absolutely demolishing and destroying and annihilating Egypt. That's what we need to have in our minds when we think about putting off the old man. This is annihilation of the old man of the flesh. Burial, returning to the abyss. That's what we need to think of as the old man. It should mean nothing to us. We need to get rid of it all and then emerge from that watery abyss, being enlightened by God's truth as a new man or woman in the Lord Jesus Christ. And brothers and sisters, the way that God does that can be sometimes quite difficult. Sometimes God, brothers and sisters, brings into our lives things which are annoying. He digs at us in our lives to convince us to listen to his voice. And sometimes we do. Sometimes our hearts are penetrated, our hard hearts are opened up to his word, and we listen. But if we don't listen, sometimes God will afflict us when things are a little bit more difficult. And sometimes, brothers and sisters, God finds it necessary to turn our world upside down, to bring into our lives things which annihilate those Egyptian worldviews that we bring with us into the wilderness of life. And God says, no, I want you to annihilate that. And he brings things into our lives that turn our whole world upside down. And this is all part of God simply wanting us to listen to his voice.